Here's my strategy on the Cold War. We win, they lose. It doesn't get much blunter than that, does it? In the early 1980s, that single, highly provocative quote perfectly captured a massive, dramatic shift in American foreign policy. Welcome to this explainer on the Second Cold War.
Today, we are unpacking a seriously intense period of geopolitical brinkmanship. By strictly analyzing the historical sources, we're going to figure out exactly how the dynamic between the USA and the Soviet Union went from a period of relative calm right back to the absolute edge of catastrophe.
Here is our agenda for today. We'll be looking at 1. The end of détente, 2. A war of words, 3. The trillion-dollar arsenal, 4. Enter Star Wars, and finally, 5. The Soviet dilemma. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The end of détente, a shift in strategy.
So, what exactly is the Second Cold War? Well, we're talking about a highly volatile window between 1979 and 1985. The crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't just your everyday, run-of-the-mill political tension. This was a deliberate, calculated rejection of détente. Ronald Reagan firmly believed that the U.S. had essentially abdicated its role as the spiritual leader of the free world. For him, the era of peaceful coexistence was officially over. Direct confrontation was back on the table.
Looking at this timeline from 1979 to 1985, you can see a rapid domino effect of deteriorating relations. The globe quickly returned to a state of severe, everyday anxiety. And this fear was so palpable that it bled directly into popular culture. You saw it vividly in genuinely terrifying television events of the time, like the American movie The Day After and the gritty British drama Threads. People were truly on edge.
Moving on to Section 2. A war of words. Good versus evil.
Think about how wild this rhetorical shift was. Reagan explicitly reframed a highly complex geopolitical standoff into a Manichaean, moral battle of absolute good versus absolute evil. Speaking to the National Association of Evangelicals in March 1983, he directly urged his audience not to ignore the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. By framing the Cold War as a righteous, almost biblical struggle between light and darkness, he signaled that there was zero room left for the diplomatic compromises we saw during the détente era.
But of course, it takes two to tango, and both sides absolutely unleashed a barrage of harsh verbal assaults, tossing out the diplomatic etiquette of the previous decade. While Reagan was out there proclaiming that Marxism-Leninism was destined for the ash heap of history, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov fired right back. He publicly called the U.S. president insane and a liar. Moscow repeatedly accused Reagan of deliberately fanning the flames of war, even going so far as to compare his administration to Hitler's. The war of words was, quite literally, scorching.
Which brings us to Section 3, the trillion-dollar arsenal, escaping the zero option.
$1 trillion. Let that staggering number sink in for a second. This represents the budget for the U.S. defense program announced by Reagan between 1981 and 1987. You have to remember, this came right on the heels of the perceived humiliations of the Vietnam War and the Iran hostage crisis. So this massive influx of cash was designed to forcefully reassert American strength and completely erase any doubts about U.S. capabilities on the global stage.
So what exactly does $1 trillion buy you in the 1980s? Terrifying new hardware. We are talking about 100 MX missiles, 100 B-1 supersonic bombers, 6 brand-new Trident nuclear submarines, radar-invisible stealth bombers, and those highly controversial neutron bombs. Plus, this incredible buildup occurred right alongside the deployment of U.S. cruise missiles in Western Europe. That was a direct counter-move to Soviet SS-20 missiles already placed in the Western Soviet Union. The arms race was well and truly back in full swing.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand that this buildup wasn't just defensive posturing, it was the bedrock of what became known as the Reagan Doctrine. The core strategy shifted from simply containing communism to actively seeking its rollback. The U.S. started providing direct, tangible support for anti-communist insurgents in places like El Salvador and Nicaragua. They sent secret assistance to Poland's Solidarity Union, explicitly banned high-tech trade with the Soviets, and even deployed U.S. forces to invade Grenada to topple its communist government. It was an active, aggressive global pushback.
But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire military shift was the pivots in strategy. For years, the world basically relied on MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's exactly what it sounds like, the belief that nuclear weapons made everyone secure because a first strike guaranteed mutual total annihilation. Nobody shoots because everyone dies. But then, tension spiked over a terrifying new theory, NUTS, or Nuclear Utilization Target Selection.
This strategy suggested aiming weapons specifically at the opponent's warheads rather than their cities. And the horrifying implication there? It suggested that a limited nuclear war could actually be fought and theoretically won.
All right, Section 4. Enter Star Wars: The Strategic Defense Initiative.
This is where things get genuinely sci-fi. Announced in March 1983, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which the media immediately dubbed Star Wars, was Reagan's utopian vision for a nuclear umbrella. The grand plan was to launch an army of satellites equipped with powerful lasers meant to intercept and destroy Soviet ballistic missiles in space, long before they could ever reach U.S. soil. Reagan honestly believed this cutting-edge technology would render Soviet missiles totally useless, essentially forcing them to disarm.
Now, Reagan pitched this as a purely defensive, peaceful measure, but SDI was a massive break from past policies. Most notably, it flat-out broke the terms of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. That treaty, which had been a hallmark of the détente era, legally committed both superpowers to use space technology strictly for peaceful purposes. This move showed the world exactly how far the U.S. was willing to go to completely rewrite the rules of the game.
So how did the Soviets react? Well, in a word, panic. They were terrified. Soviet leader Yuri Andropov didn't see SDI as a harmless defensive shield. He saw it as an offensive enabler. He argued it was a calculated bid to disarm the Soviet Union, asserting that a working shield would allow the U.S. to launch a first-strike nuclear attack without any fear of retaliation. Honestly, even former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara went on the record saying the Soviets could be entirely forgiven for believing SDI was a quest for a first-strike capability.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, the Soviet Dilemma, the Technological Trap.
The Soviet leadership was in an absolute state of shock when SDI was announced, mainly because they knew deep down they simply couldn't compete. Look at the facts. America had already won the race to the moon back in 1969 and had successfully developed the space shuttle. Meanwhile, the Soviet economy was extremely fragile. It just could not produce enough wealth to fund everyday consumer goods, maintain standard conventional military spending, and suddenly launch into a brand new, astronomically expensive, space-based arms race. On top of all that, the USSR was severely lagging behind America's rapidly booming computer technology sector.
It's a massive catch-22. Honestly, the ultimate tech irony. Just look at how this breaks down. Developing a Star Wars-type program fundamentally requires highly advanced computers. In the US, the computer market is exploding. But over in the USSR, Soviet leaders were deeply paranoid about computers. They actually restricted things like modems and printers out of fear they'd be used by citizens to leak state secrets or print anti-government propaganda. So the very computer networks required to survive this new high-tech arms race were heavily restricted because they threatened a Communist Party's domestic control. No way they could develop their own SDI under those conditions.
And this brings us to the absolute core of the U.S. strategy. Reagan's approach recognized that forcing the Soviets to match American spending wasn't merely about achieving military superiority in the short term. It was intentional economic warfare. Knowing the Soviet economy was already on incredibly shaky ground, the U.S. anticipated that by escalating the arms race with monumental, budget-breaking projects like SDI, the USSR would desperately try to compete. And in doing so, they would likely trigger their own economic collapse.
This overwhelming, highly calculated pressure forced a massive reality check in Moscow. The stark realization that their economy and technological infrastructure were simply no match for the West paved the way for a totally new type of leader. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, this exact economic pressure, combined with the technological shock of SDI, became a massive driving factor behind his famous New Thinking. He realized the old strategy of competing head-to-head with the West was, for all intents and purposes, dead.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. When you look at this strategy, the highly aggressive rhetoric, the trillion-dollar arms buildup, and the impossible technological trap of Star Wars, was it a necessary political masterstroke that effectively brought an end to the Cold War? Or was this high-stakes brinkmanship an incredibly reckless, dangerous gamble with global survival? Thank you for exploring the gripping and complex history of the Second Cold War with me today.